Before the story begins, make sure to like, subscribe, and let me know. What time do you usually watch videos? And don't forget to suggest the next story or content you'd like to see. Story 1. The dormitory corridor that walked backward at midnight. There are stories whispered in hushed tones among students, stories that never make it to campus brochures or glossy university guides. These are the legends passed from one group of freshmen to the next, the kind that begins as a joke, then turns into nervous laughter, and finally into silence when the air in the room feels too heavy. One of those stories belonged to East Wing Dormitory, specifically the long, narrow corridor on the third floor. When students first moved in, they always noticed something peculiar about that corridor. It was longer than it should have been, stretching past the reasonable dimensions of the building. Its fluorescent lights flickered just a little too often, and the gray linoleum floor was scuffed in strange patterns, as though hundreds of feet had stopped mid-stride, pivoted, and then walked backward. The story begins with a girl named Marissa, a sophomore who had just transferred and knew nothing of the whispers. To her, East Wing seemed old but charming. She was placed in room 317, right in the middle of the notorious corridor. The first night, she heard them. It was close to midnight when Marissa woke to the sound of footsteps. At first, she thought it was someone returning late from the library. The steps were slow, steady, and echoing along the hall. She checked her phone. 12:04 a.m. She listened, waiting for the sound to fade as whoever it was reached their room. But the steps didn't stop. They went past her door, then paused, and slowly began to retrace themselves in reverse. It wasn't just a student pacing. She could hear the difference. The rhythm of the steps backward didn't sound natural, as if someone were replaying the sound of walking in reverse, heels scraping after the toe. It sent a shiver through her. Marissa pressed her ear to the door. She thought about opening it to look, but something in her chest tightened, a primal warning not to. Instead, she climbed back into bed, pulled the covers up, and told herself it was nothing. The next morning at breakfast, she asked casually if anyone had been walking the halls at night. The table went quiet. One girl muttered, "You heard it, didn't you?" They explained the legend. Decades ago, a student had been found dead in that very corridor. Some said he'd been walking to his room when he suddenly turned around, heading back the way he came, only to collapse mid-step. No one knew why. Since then, footsteps had been heard around midnight, walking forward, then backward, as if retracing his final moments. Marissa laughed it off, but she noticed the other students didn't. That night, she told herself she wouldn't care if it happened again. But at 12:03, just as she was drifting into sleep, the footsteps returned. This time, they stopped directly outside her door. Her breath caught in her throat. She held still, the silence so heavy she could hear her own heartbeat. And then, slowly, the footsteps began moving again, backward, one by one, until the sound faded into nothing. Marissa didn't sleep. Over the next week, it became a ritual. Every night at midnight, the footsteps came. Forward first, down the hall, a pause, then backward again. Always the same pattern, always the same pace, as though someone invisible was doomed to walk endlessly in repetition. But on the seventh night, something changed. This time, the steps stopped outside her door again. Only they didn't reverse immediately. They stayed there, unmoving. She waited, clutching the sheets, every muscle in her body frozen. Minutes passed. Still nothing. Finally, she whispered to herself, "It's not real. It's just a story." And then she heard it, a second set of footsteps, faint, almost like an echo, starting at the far end of the corridor. These steps were different, lighter, faster, coming toward hers. She realized with horror that there were now two sets, one waiting outside her door, the other approaching. When the two sets met, the silence that followed was worse than any sound. No creak of the floorboards, no breath, no movement. Just the feeling of something wrong lingering right outside her door. The next morning, she packed a bag and tried to request a room transfer. The dorm manager only gave her a tight-lipped look and said, "East Wing is full. You'll have to stay." The following nights blurred into one another. The footsteps continued, but their behavior grew stranger. Sometimes they reversed earlier, sometimes later. Once, she swore they reversed inside her room. She woke to find her desk chair pulled slightly away from the desk, as though someone had sat and then slid back. Marissa began to research the history of East Wing. Buried in the university archives, she found an article from the 1960s about a student named Leonard Hayes. He'd been obsessed with repetition, with walking paths in exact patterns. His friends said he would pace halls, walk forward, then backward, muttering about symmetry. One night, he was found lying face down in the corridor, his body twisted unnaturally, as if he'd tried to walk backward too fast and had broken himself in the process. The article ended with a single line. Some say he never stopped walking. On the 10th night, Marissa decided she had to see for herself. She set her phone to record and placed it on the desk, camera angled at the door. At exactly midnight, the footsteps began. Her heart thundered in her chest, but she forced herself to stay in bed, eyes wide open, staring at the door. The steps came closer, closer, until they were right outside her room. Then silence. Her phone screen glowed faintly, recording everything. And then, without warning, the doorknob began to turn. Marissa sat up, frozen, her throat too tight to scream. The knob twisted halfway, then stopped. Slowly, the footsteps retreated, this time backward at an impossible speed, vanishing into the far end of the hall. In the morning, she checked the recording. Her stomach dropped. The video showed the doorknob turning, yes, but it also showed something else. A faint reflection in the metal. A face. Pale, hollow-eyed, staring directly into the camera. Marissa left East Wing that same day. She didn't wait for a transfer, didn't ask permission. She simply packed and moved off campus, even if it meant commuting hours to class. Years later, she still swears she hears it sometimes. When she's alone in her apartment, late at night, she'll hear the faint sound of footsteps down the hall. Forward first, then backward. Always backward, and always stopping right outside her door. Story 2. The hospital ward, where steps retrace themselves. Hospitals carry a silence unlike any other place. Even during the day, beneath the constant hum of machines, the shuffle of nurses' shoes, and the muffled voices of visitors, there is a weight in the air, a reminder that within those walls, lives balance on a fragile edge between healing and loss. At night, however, that silence shifts into something more oppressive, a stillness that feels too deliberate, as if the building itself is holding its breath. It was in one such silence, on the 4th floor of an aging hospital wing, that Nurse Evelyn began to notice something strange. She worked the overnight shift, the hours when most patients slept fitfully, when the fluorescent lights dimmed and shadows grew long across the tiled floor. Her ward wasn't especially busy. 6 rooms lined along a corridor, each housing 1 or 2 patients recovering from various ailments. She had worked there for nearly 3 years, and nothing out of the ordinary had ever occurred. Until the footsteps. The first time she heard them, she assumed it was another nurse making her rounds. The sound was faint but distinct, shoes clicking softly along the linoleum hall. She looked up from her desk at the nurse's station and glanced toward the far end of the corridor. No one was there. The sound continued, steady, deliberate steps approaching. Evelyn stood, her body tightening with unease. Just as the steps reached the midpoint of the hallway, directly outside room 3, they stopped. Then, without pause, they began again, moving backward. The sound was unmistakable, the same rhythm, the same weight, but now retracing themselves exactly. The invisible walker was stepping back along the corridor, each footfall matching the path it had just taken in reverse, until the noise faded into silence at the far end of the hall. Evelyn's first thought was that exhaustion was playing tricks on her. Overnight shifts could do that. But when she leaned over the counter and scanned the corridor again, she saw something chilling. Several patients had stirred. A frail man in room 2 was sitting upright, his eyes wide and fixed on the doorway. A woman in room 5 clutched her blanket tightly around her chest. They had heard it too. That night, she told no one. Hospitals bred rumors fast, and she didn't want to be the subject of hushed conversations in the break room. But the footsteps returned. Night after night, always the same pattern. Walking steadily forward until the midpoint of the corridor, then turning back in perfect sequence, as though undoing themselves. It wasn't every night, but when it happened, Evelyn noticed a chilling detail. The footsteps always stopped exactly outside the room of the patient who would die within the next 48 hours. The first time she connected the two events, she told herself it was coincidence. Room 3 housed an elderly man with advanced pneumonia. His passing was expected. But then it happened again outside Room 6, where a middle-aged woman had been recovering well from surgery. She was cheerful, even optimistic, and her doctors were confident. Yet 2 nights after the phantom steps paused outside her door, she was gone, her heart failing suddenly in the early hours of the morning. By the third incident, Evelyn could no longer dismiss it. She began to dread the nights, listening with growing anxiety for that steady tread of invisible shoes. Once she even tried to walk the corridor herself, right behind the sound, hoping to catch sight of whoever, or whatever, was causing it. But each time the hallway remained stubbornly empty, the air thick with an unseen presence. One particularly cold November night, Evelyn was not alone at the station. A younger nurse, Marco, was completing his probationary rotation. When the footsteps began, Evelyn froze, her pen dropping to the desk. Marco frowned, tilting his head. "You hear that?" he whispered. Evelyn's throat went dry. "Yes." The steps advanced toward room 4, slow and measured. Both of them rose to their feet, staring into the dimly lit hall. The steps halted outside the door of Mrs. Hanley, a kindly grandmother recovering from a broken hip. Evelyn prayed the sound would stop there, would fade without consequence. But it didn't. The steps reversed, retreating in perfect rhythm until the hall was silent again. Mrs. Hanley passed away the next afternoon. Her death shocked the entire staff. Her vitals had been stable. Her prognosis was good. The doctors called it an unexpected cardiac arrest. Evelyn and Marco exchanged no words about what they both knew they had heard, but the silence between them was enough. From then on, Evelyn began to mark each occurrence in her shift notes, though never in plain words. She created small symbols in the margins of her charts, dots and dashes that only she could understand. Within months, a disturbing pattern emerged. The footsteps didn't simply foreshadow death. They seemed to select it. Patients who were stable, those with every chance of recovery, were claimed just as surely as those already in decline. One night, she tried something desperate. When the footsteps began, she stood in the hall, blocking the invisible path. As they approached, her chest tightened, her skin prickling with cold. The steps slowed, but did not stop. They circled her, an invisible force brushing so close that she felt her hair lift. Then they continued on, pausing outside room 2. She knocked frantically, rushing inside to check on the patient, an old woman with pneumonia. But the woman was fine, breathing steadily, even smiling faintly in her sleep. Evelyn almost allowed herself relief. 2 days later, the woman was gone. That was when Evelyn realized the truth. Nothing she did could stop it. The footsteps were not a warning to be heeded or a pattern to be broken. They were a ritual, a claiming as though the hospital itself, or something older that lingered within it, was retracing the final steps of those it had chosen. Word spread quietly among the patients. Evelyn never confessed, but whispers grew. Families would ask why their loved ones had been moved to different rooms, hoping to escape the invisible curse of the hallway. Some patients begged not to be left alone at night. Others said they, too, had heard the retracing steps, always too close, always just beyond the door. Evelyn stayed at the hospital for another year, but the weight of the footsteps wore her down. She could no longer bear the dread that came with each night shift, the sickening anticipation whenever the corridor fell silent, waiting for that first echoing step. When she finally resigned, she left without explanation. The hospital continues to operate. Nurses and staff still speak of the footsteps, though only in hushed voices, as if giving the phenomenon too much attention might draw it nearer. Patients, too, still whisper about the sound that moves forward and then backward, as though time itself is being unraveled. And somewhere, late at night, in the dim corridor of that aging ward, those phantom steps still trace and retrace their path, marking another soul for departure, their rhythm a cold, inevitable countdown to silence. Story 3. The Old Manor's Endless Hall of Returning Footsteps. When Marcus inherited the old Whitfield Manor from his great-uncle, he knew the place had a reputation. The sprawling 18th century estate stood at the edge of a fog-drenched village in the English countryside, its stone facade worn and its windows like empty eyes. Villagers rarely went near it, And when Marcus arrived with plans to renovate, he was greeted with polite nods but uneasy silence whenever he mentioned the house. He assumed it was simply rural superstition, stories to keep children away from crumbling ruins. But there was one tale that kept surfacing, spoken only in hushed tones: the Hall of Returning Footsteps. The hall itself stretched impossibly long across the second floor, lined with portraits of Whitfield ancestors whose painted gazes seemed to follow anyone who passed. The floorboards creaked as though sighing under centuries of secrets. But it wasn't the portraits, nor the drafty air, nor the flickering sconces that made the hall infamous. It was the sound of footsteps. Locals swore that if one walked the length of the hall at night, their own footsteps would begin to change rhythm midway through. By the time they reached the far end, the steps behind them would reverse, retracing, one by one, exactly as they had come. Not an echo, but a presence. Marcus dismissed it as ghost stories. He had spent most of his life in cities, detached from rural superstition, and thought himself above such tales. Still, the legend nagged at him. On his third night in the manor, after workers had gone and silence settled across the estate, he decided to test it for himself. Armed with only a lantern, he stepped into the corridor. The glow cast his shadow across faded wallpaper, over the watchful faces in the portraits. His footsteps rang out, steady, deliberate. He counted them as he went, more for comfort than precision. 34, 35, 36. Halfway down, the air shifted. The draft stopped. The manor seemed to exhale, as though holding its breath. Marcus slowed. His own footfalls suddenly seemed distant, detached. At step 43, he froze. Behind him, a second step landed. Not an echo, not delayed. A step that belonged to someone else. His breath caught in his throat. He turned sharply, lantern swinging. The hall stretched behind him, empty, his shadow quivering across the wall. No one was there. Forcing a nervous laugh, he faced forward again and continued, faster now. His boots struck wood at 44, 45, 46. And then it came again. 46, 45, 44. The sound of steps retreating exactly as his advanced. It was impossible. His pace quickened into a jog, then a near run. At 70, he reached the carved double doors at the far end, heart hammering. The doors rattled against their frames, swollen with age and locked from the other side. Behind him, the phantom steps reversed, racing back toward the beginning of the hall. When silence finally fell, Marcus stood trembling, forehead slick with sweat. He didn't sleep that night. He told himself it was a trick of acoustics, sound bouncing strangely through old architecture. But a small, unrelenting part of him knew better. The next day, he avoided the hall entirely. But curiosity clawed at him. The village librarian, a woman in her 70s with cataract-clouded eyes, seemed to sense his unease when he visited for records. When he asked about the hall, her wrinkled hands tightened around the edge of her desk. "They walk it still," she whispered. "Those who never left." She explained that during the late 1800s, Whitfield Manor served as a refuge during a typhoid outbreak. Dozens were quarantined in the manor, many of them children. They were kept on the upper floors, forbidden to leave the long hall that connected their makeshift infirmaries. But care was scarce. At night, fevered and delirious, the children wandered up and down that passage. Some died mid-walk, collapsing before reaching their rooms. Their steps never stopped, the librarian said. They return, always, to the beginning. Always searching. Marcus felt ice crawl under his skin. That night, against reason, he returned to the hall with a recorder. He wanted proof, or perhaps reassurance that it was merely imagination. He placed the device at the hall's center, then walked to one end. Each step he took landed heavy in the recorder's faint red glow. When he reached the doors, he turned back and froze. The lantern flickered. The portraits seemed closer somehow, the faces more watchful, their eyes less painted and more alive. And there it was again, the unmistakable sound of steps returning, one by one, in reverse. He clutched the recorder to his chest, forcing himself not to look back until he reached the opposite end. When he finally shut the recorder off and replayed it, the air left his lungs. The device had captured both sets of footsteps, his going forward and another set, perfectly synchronized in reverse. But there was something else. A faint sound layered beneath the steps. Whispers, dozens of voices murmuring, fragmented, like children calling to each other in fever dreams. He could almost make out words, though not clearly enough to understand. Marcus didn't enter the hall again. He hired contractors to seal the doors with heavy boards, refusing to explain why. Workers muttered about superstition, but none asked to test the hall themselves. Still, at night, lying in his bed 2 floors below, Marcus could hear them. The steps, faint but insistent, retracing their endless path. Forward, then back. Forward, then back. Sometimes he thought he heard them pause, waiting, and sometimes he wondered what would happen if one day the steps didn't reverse, if instead they continued toward him. Story 4, the school basement, where footsteps turned around. The basement of Westbridge Middle School was the kind of place that kids dared each other to go into, but almost never actually did. It wasn't just because it was dark, damp, and smelled of mildew, though it was all of those things. It was because of the footsteps. Everyone knew the story. If you walked down there when the school was empty, when all was quiet, you could hear them. Footsteps echoing in the long cement hallway. Sometimes fast, sometimes slow, always steady. But the strangest part, the part that kept the story alive for decades, was that the footsteps always reversed. You would hear them walking toward you, closer, louder, and then, halfway down the hall, they would turn around. The sound would retreat, step by step, back into the shadows where they had come from. And if you tried to follow them, you'd find yourself caught in a loop, always chasing something that was never really there. Melissa Carter had been teaching at Westbridge for only a year when she first heard about it. The older teachers laughed it off like an urban legend. But Melissa wasn't so quick to dismiss it. She had grown up in a town where abandoned houses whispered, where roads twisted into forests no one entered at night. She believed that places carried memory, and that memory sometimes refused to die. It wasn't until the winter of her first year, after staying late to grade papers, that she found herself alone in the basement. She hadn't meant to go down there. She was searching for a stack of forgotten textbooks, and had been told the janitor might have left them in the storage room below. The stairwell was colder than it should have been, her footsteps hollow against the concrete. She told herself not to be foolish, not to listen for the stories, but then she stopped. Somewhere down the hallway, she heard it, soft but deliberate, footsteps. At first she thought it might be the janitor. She stood still, waiting. The steps grew louder, closer, like someone was walking toward her with no rush, no hesitation. The sound of shoes against cement echoed in rhythm, slow, unbroken. Melissa's pulse quickened. She leaned forward, straining to see. The corridor stretched long, lined with storage rooms and boiler pipes that rattled faintly. The overhead lights flickered every few seconds, buzzing with age, and still the footsteps came. Then, right before they should have reached the halfway point, they stopped. The silence was sharp. Melissa's chest tightened. The next sound made her throat go dry. The steps resumed, but not forward. They were moving back, retracing. Each one was the mirror of the last, echoing perfectly as though whoever or whatever had been approaching had simply turned around, now walking away from her. Melissa forced herself to speak, though her voice trembled. "Hello? Who's there?" No answer, only retreating steps, echoing into the shadows. She didn't follow. Not that night. She fled up the stairwell, shutting the heavy door behind her, and tried to laugh it off in the staff lounge. But the sound stayed with her, replaying in her head like a record she couldn't stop. The next day, she asked the janitor, Mr. Green, about it. He went quiet, his face tightening in a way she hadn't expected. Finally, he said, "Basement ain't a place you want to wander. Not alone." Melissa pressed him, but he only muttered, "Not the first time footsteps been heard down there. Won't be the last." Weeks passed. She couldn't let it go. Every time she stayed late at school, her eyes drifted toward the stairwell door. It became an itch in her mind, a question she couldn't stop scratching. What was making those steps? By spring, she had decided to go back. One Friday evening, when the halls were empty and the sunset bled through the high windows, Melissa took a flashlight and descended. Her heart pounded harder with each step. The basement was as she remembered. Long corridor, damp air, walls sweating with age. She walked slowly, the beam of her flashlight cutting across stacked chairs and old science lab equipment. Then it began. Step, step, step. She froze. The footsteps were returning, steady as before. They were approaching, matching her heartbeat. Louder, louder. She gripped the flashlight until her knuckles ached. Halfway down the corridor, they stopped. Melissa whispered, "Show yourself." The silence pressed against her ears. Then, step, step, step. The sound reversed, receding, exactly as before. This time, she followed. Her shoes tapped quickly as she kept pace with the sound, chasing it deeper into the basement. But the further she went, the longer the hall seemed to stretch. The doors on either side blurred together. The air grew colder. The steps ahead of her never faltered, never quickened, always the same rhythm. She realized, with sudden terror, that she had no idea how far she had gone. The basement wasn't supposed to be this long. Panic rose in her throat. She turned, intending to run back. But when she did, her breath caught. The hall behind her stretched on endlessly, lights flickering in a line that seemed to go forever. And now, there were footsteps behind her. They matched the ones ahead, a perfect mirror. One set receding into the darkness before her, another retreating into the shadows behind. Melissa stood trapped between them, her pulse hammering in her ears, the sound of shoes clicking forward and backward in a loop she could not escape. She screamed. The flashlight flickered and died. In the dark, the footsteps circled her. Forward, backward, always moving, always returning. She spun, desperate, but every direction sounded the same. Then, just as suddenly as it had begun, it stopped. Melissa stumbled, gasping in the silence. The flashlight blinked weakly back to life, revealing the stairwell only a few feet away. Shaking, she bolted upward, slamming the door shut behind her. She never went back to the basement. Not once. But the sound followed her in dreams. Footsteps walking toward her, stopping, then retracing themselves again and again. She came to believe the basement was more than just haunted. It was a trap. A loop of echoes from something that refused to leave, pulling anyone curious enough to listen into its endless rhythm. And though Melissa left Westbridge Middle School the next year, some nights she swears she hears them still, steps in the hallway outside her apartment, walking toward her door, then stopping, turning, and walking away. Every hallway, every corridor, every step we take carries a trace of those who walked before us. But when the echoes move against us, reversing, retracing, defying the natural order, they remind us that not all paths are ours alone to walk. Sometimes the footsteps that follow don't belong to the living, and sometimes they're walking back to find you.